Okay, so let's unpack this. We often hear the term Anthropocene thrown around these days.
Oh, absolutely, all the time.
Right, and usually when we picture it, we're thinking about climate change or maybe, those massive islands of plastic floating in the Pacific.
Yeah, exactly. The really highly visible stuff.
It's the whole idea that human fingerprints are just all over the geological record. But there is this entirely other massive defining feature of this era that it just doesn't get quite the same headline treatment,
It really doesn't.
even though it is fundamentally rewriting the code of life on Earth.
It is. We are quite literally living through a global reshuffling of species.
Yeah.
It's this completely unprecedented interchange of organisms where human beings have essentially broken down the biogeographical barriers.
Oceans and mountain ranges and things.
Exactly, the barriers that kept ecosystems totally separate for millions of years. We are basically mixing the world's biological deck.
Mixing the deck, I like that. And today we are doing a deep dive into a major new paper that tries to actually make sense of all this chaos.
That's right.
It's titled The Impacts of Biological Invasions, and it was published in the journal Biological Reviews. It's led by Philip J. Haubrock and a really massive team of international researchers.
Massive is the right word.
And I have to say, the scope of this thing is huge. It's not just a single study. It's a scoping review.
Yeah, it's a truly monumental piece of work. They've synthesized insights from nearly a century of gray literature and expert reports. And their mission wasn't just to give us another list of bad bugs or scary weeds.
Right, because I think that's where our brains usually go when we hear the topic. We think, oh, invasive species, that's just a list of pests we need to squash.
Precisely. And that is a very, very limited view. The goal of this paper is to move beyond those simple good versus bad labels.
Okay.
They want to understand the actual mechanisms of change. How do these non-native species reshape our world, not just ecologically, but economically and socioculturally? It's about understanding the complexity and the mechanisms, not just counting the damage.
So before we get into the crazy examples, and we do have some really wild ones today, from screaming frogs to killer shrimp, we need to set the foundation.
Always a good idea.
What exactly are we talking about here? What defines an invasion? Because, my grandmother's tulips are non-native, but I don't think they're destroying the neighborhood.
Right. That's a really crucial distinction. Not every non-native species is an invader.
Okay.
A non-native species is simply an organism that has been moved outside its native range by humans. But a biological invasion involves a very specific sequence.
Which is what?
Translocation, establishment, and then spread. And crucially, for the purpose of this paper, it involves impact. If the plant is just sitting in a garden doing nothing, it's not really the focus of this study.
Got it. And while this feels like a very modern problem, like a side effect of shipping containers and globalization, the paper points out that this has a surprisingly deep history.
It does. We often cite Charles Elton's 1958 book as the birth of this scientific field, but humans have been acting as a biological conveyor belt for millennia.
Yeah, they brought up some wild historical examples.
They did. The paper highlights the Austronesian expansion way back between 3000 and 1500 BC.
This is when humans were migrating across the Pacific to all those remote islands, right?
Exactly. And they didn't travel alone. They brought the Pacific rat with them.
Oh, wow.
And that single introduction permanently altered the ecological trajectories of those islands thousands of years ago.
Incredible.
Or take the Roman Empire. They actually attempted one of the first recorded eradications. They introduced European rabbits to the Balearic Islands, and the rabbits devastated the crops so badly it caused a literal famine.
So the Romans, the empire that conquered the known world, was almost taken down by bunnies?
In a specific region, yes. It got so bad the Romans had to deploy ferrets to try and hunt them down.
You're kidding.
That was basically biological warfare. So we've been dealing with the fallout of moving species around since the time of Augustus. That really puts things in perspective.
It really does.
Yeah.
Now, to make sense of all this history in biology, the authors propose a new conceptual model. They break it down into 3 pillars of invasion impacts.
Right. If you want to really understand this global reshuffling, you have to look at it through 3 lenses. First, the impact domains. So that's ecological, economic, and sociocultural.
Okay.
Second, the challenges. Things like data gaps and the fact that context changes everything.
Yeah.
And third, assessments. How we actually measure the risk and the damage.
Let's start with that first pillar, specifically the ecological impacts, because this is usually what we think of first nature messing with nature. But the paper makes a really interesting distinction here between the mechanism and the consequence.
Yes, this is a vital nuance based on a framework by Britton from 2023. We often confuse how an impact happens with what happens.
Right.
The mechanism is the process, like predation or competition. The consequence is the result, like a population crashing or a species going extinct.
That makes sense.
If you don't understand the mechanism, you can't manage the problem. You're just treating the symptom.
So let's look at some of these mechanisms. One of the big ones is competition. But it's not always just two animals physically fighting over a piece of food, right? It's not just a brawl.
No, it's much more subtle than that. Of course, there is direct competition for resources. But the paper discusses behavioral interference. A fascinating example is the American bullfrog. It's invasive in many parts of the world.
The really big, loud one.
Very loud. Their calling activity is so intense that it actually occupies the acoustic space.
Wait, what does that mean?
It forces native frog species to change the pitch or the spectral properties of their own calls just to be heard over the bullfrogs.
So they're literally drowning out the locals.
Essentially, yes. And think about the energy cost of that for the native frogs.
Right.
If they have to scream in a different pitch or call at completely different times of day that it affects their mating success, they aren't starving to death, they're being silenced.
That is wild. It's like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert. Eventually you just give up.
Exactly. That is a mechanism of impact that you simply wouldn't see if you were just measuring body mass or food supply.
Another mechanism they mention is predation, but specifically coupled with this idea of naivety.
Yes, the naivety factor. This happens when a native species simply has no evolutionary history with a new predator. They just don't recognize it as a threat.
Because they've never seen anything like it.
Right. Evolution is an arms race, but these native species haven't been in the race with this specific predator. The paper points to the killer shrimp Dickerogammarus villosus in Europe.
Killer shrimp is a terrifying name for a crustacean. Does it actually live up to the hype?
It absolutely earns the name. It's a voracious predator of native invertebrates. Because the native species are naive to it, they don't know to hide or flee. The shrimp can just decimate populations.
Wow.
This simplifies the entire food web. You go from a complex ecosystem with lots of different bugs to a very simple one dominated by one highly aggressive shrimp.
Then there's hybridization. This one feels a bit more abstract, but the implications seem huge. The paper calls this genetic pollution.
It is genetic pollution. When a non-native species is closely related to a native one, they might interbreed. You might look at a river and see fish swimming around and think, well, the animals are surviving.
Right, it looks fine on the surface.
But you are actively losing the distinct native genotype. The native species, in a genetic sense, is being erased. It's a silent extinction. You lose the entire library of genetic adaptation that took millions of years to build.
And finally, under ecological mechanisms, we have ecosystem engineering. This is when the invader actually rebuilds the house, so to speak.
Exactly. They physically alter the environment itself.
Yeah.
Earthworms are the classic example here.
Wait, earthworms?
Yes. Most of us think of earthworms as good. They aerate the garden. But in North American forests that were historically worm-free since the last ice age, the arrival of invasive earthworms is a total disaster.
Why? What are they doing to the forest?
They consume the leaf litter layer that native plants and tree seedlings rely on. They change the soil nutrient cycling completely. So the forest floor itself changes from a spongy organic layer to bare, compacted soil.
So the trees that evolved to grow in that spongy layer simply can't survive anymore.
Completely. Another dramatic example is the dusky spinefoot. It's a fish in the Mediterranean. It grazes on algae so intensively that it turns lush algal forests to rocky barrens. It strips the entire ecosystem down to the bare rock.
That is actually a perfect segue into the second domain, the human equation. Because if you strip a reef down to bare rock, that has to affect people too.
It absolutely does. And usually when we talk about people, we talk about money. Economic costs are often what drive policy because they're so much easier to measure. We can easily calculate the cost of lost timber or decimated crops.
But the paper argues that the sociocultural impacts are the ones that are vastly understudied. These are the things that affect our well-being, our heritage, our identity. This felt like the most human part of the whole paper to me.
It is. This is where it gets really interesting and frankly a bit emotional. Biological invasions can affect human health. Directly, think of common ragweed causing massive pollen allergies, or zebra mussels having shells so sharp they cut the feet of swimmers.
Right, making recreational areas basically unusable.
Exactly, but it goes much deeper into culture.
Like the box tree moth.
Yes. In the eastern Black Sea region, the box tree isn't just a plant. It has deep, religious and cultural significance. It's used in local ceremonies. It's a core part of the landscape of their heritage.
Wow.
So the invasion of the box tree moth is causing the decline of these trees. And that's not just an economic loss of timber, it's a loss of heritage. It's a piece of their culture disappearing right along with the biology.
There was also that really complex example from northern Norway regarding salmon. That felt like a real clash of values.
It is a very current conflict. The invasion of pink salmon is actively challenging the traditional Atlantic salmon fishing culture there. For the locals, fishing for Atlantic salmon is part of their identity. It's who they are. Now, this new species arrives the pink salmon. It's edible, it's a fish, but it is not their fish.
So they see it as pollution.
They see it as a direct threat to their tradition. It sparks this massive debate about identity versus adaptation. Do we accept this new resource because it is food after all, or do we fight to keep our identity pure? It disrupts the traditional calendar and their whole cultural connection to the river.
That brings us squarely to the complexity of all this. The paper makes a big point that we can't just universally label species as villains. Context is everything.
This is what we call the good invader paradox. The significance of an impact is often in the eye of the beholder.
Like the black locust tree.
A perfect example of conflicting values. Ecologically, the black locust can be a disaster. It negatively impacts native biodiversity, and it actually changes the soil chemistry.
But people plant it on purpose.
Right, because it provides excellent soil stabilization, and it is a major source of nectar for honey production. So if you are a conservationist, it's a pest. But if you are a beekeeper or someone trying to stop a hillside from eroding, it's a hero.
And what about that dusky spinefoot fish you mentioned, the one that strips the Mediterranean reefs down to rock?
Same exact story. Ecologically, it's causing severe harm by destroying habitat, but economically, it has become a high-value catch for fisheries in Cyprus. It's actually ranking first in catch volume and value there.
So the fishermen are thrilled, but the marine biologists are horrified.
Precisely. And look at trout. Rainbow trout are invasive predators in many places, driving native fish to extinction. But in Patagonia, they support a massive tourism economy. People fly from all over the world just to fish for them.
So what does this all mean for management? Because it seems impossible to please everyone.
It is incredibly difficult. Management ultimately becomes a negotiation of human values. The paper also highlights a very sobering reality regarding inequality here.
How so?
Well, often wealthier nations might tolerate some ecological loss if there's a clear economic gain like the sport fishing industry. But poorer nations often bear the disproportionate costs.
Because they rely more directly on the local ecosystem.
Exactly. If an invasive pest destroys subsistence agriculture, those communities don't have the buffer of a tourism economy to fall back on. They just lose their food supply.
So we have these incredibly complex impacts. Why is it so hard to study them comprehensively? The paper dedicates a whole section to the challenges.
One of the biggest challenges is time lags. We often assume that if a species arrives, we will see the impacts immediately. But that's just not true. There are sleeper populations.
Like a dormant volcano.
In a way, yes. Remember the killer shrimp in Europe we mentioned earlier?
It's a terrifying one, yeah.
It had a lag phase of about 28 years.
Wait, 28 years?
Yes. It was there. It was established, but it didn't explode in spatial expansion and impact for almost 3 decades.
That's incredible.
So if you had studied it in year 5 or year 10, you would have published a paper saying this shrimp is completely harmless, and you would have been entirely wrong. This makes short-term ecological studies very unreliable.
And I imagine there are biases in what we even choose to study in the first place, too.
Huge biases. First, there is negativity bias. Researchers tend to look for harm. We don't often get grant funding to study a non-native species that is just minding its own business or doing something mildly beneficial.
Right. And then there is taxonomic bias. Let me guess we study the big, furry, or scary things.
Exactly. We study the charismatic invaders or the major agricultural pests. We completely ignore the microscopic groups, the fungi, the small invertebrates, even though they might be driving massive foundational changes in the soil or the water.
And what about geographic bias?
Most of our data comes from wealthy Western nations. We have mountains of data on invasions in Europe and North America and massive blind spots in the rest of the world. That severely skews our understanding of what biological invasions actually look like on a global scale.
Plus, you can't really isolate the invader from everything else happening in the world right now.
Right. This is the issue of confounding factors. Is the native species dying off because of the invader, or is it because of climate change?
Well,
or agricultural runoff? Or habitat loss?
it's probably a mix of everything.
Usually it's all of them acting together. They act synergistically. The invader might just be the final straw that breaks the camel's back.
So given all this complexity and uncertainty and the conflicting human values, where do we go from here? What does the Haubrock paper actually suggest we do?
They emphasize a few key directions for the future. First, we desperately need standardization. We need a common language to compare how bad a rat on an island is versus a weed in a forest.
Because otherwise you're comparing apples to oranges.
Exactly. The paper discusses systems like EICAT, the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa, and SACAT, which is the equivalent for socioeconomic impacts. We need to score these things consistently so governments can prioritize where to spend their limited budgets.
Because we clearly can't fight every single battle.
We can't. And that leads directly to their second point. We need a major shift from reactive management to proactive management.
Meaning what exactly?
Right now, we mostly just try to clean up the mess after the invasion has already spread. We need to focus heavily on biosecurity and prevention, stop them before they get established.
Yeah.
It is so much cheaper to stop a contaminated boat than to drain a massive lake.
That seems to require a lot of people working together.
Absolutely. Global coordination is non-negotiable here. Biological invasions do not respect political borders. A cargo ship leaving a port in one continent is a vector for another. The solution requires strict international agreements like the CBDIG targets and research networks that span across different disciplines and countries.
And finally, they talk about public engagement.
This brings us right back to the human values. Because impacts are so subjective, science alone cannot make the final decision.
Right.
If one group wants the trout for tourism and another wants the native fish restored for their heritage, that is not a scientific question. It is a societal one.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Management has to involve local stakeholders, local knowledge, and a real public debate about what we actually value in our ecosystems.
It's a lot to digest. It really reframes the whole issue from simple pest control to basically managing a rapidly changing world.
It really does.
Yeah.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, biological invasions are one of the true defining features of the Anthropocene. They are complex, they are context-dependent, and they are deeply intertwined with our economy and our culture.
Yeah.
We are way past the point of just keeping nature in a pristine glass box. It's messy.
It is very messy. And I want to leave you, our listeners, with a final thought today, something that wasn't explicitly spelled out in the paper, but feels like the ghost kind of haunting this whole conversation. It's the idea of shifting baselines.
Ah, yes. The idea that what we consider normal nature changes with every single generation.
Exactly. As these new species integrate and as time passes, your kids might look at a black locust tree or a pink salmon jumping in a river and just see nature. They won't know it wasn't there 100 years ago.
What?
Are we moving toward a homogenized Pangai of survivors where every ecosystem looks kind of the same? And if we are, does it matter if the ecological function is still somewhat there? That's the question I'll be thinking about tonight.
It is a profound question. The very nature of nature itself is evolving.
Thank you for listening to this episode.